Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling something huge. We're questioning the very chronological structures that so much of Western history and religious tradition are built on.
It's a massive undertaking. And for this, we're drawing our sources from material curated for you from the English BookCast.
That's right, we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the arguments made by David M. Rohl in his 2015 book, Exodus, Myth or History.
And it's important to frame this correctly right from the start. This deep dive, this first part, isn't about finding evidence for the Exodus. It's actually about understanding the reasons for its dismissal.
Exactly. We are focusing just on the introductory section of Rohl's book, the part he calls Part 1, The Creation of a Myth.
So our mission really is to get our heads around how this foundational story, the Exodus, came to be so widely rejected by modern archaeology. And then we'll look at the first cracks that Rohl starts to poke in that consensus.
Okay, so let's just rip the Band-Aid off right away. Rohl lays out this pretty painful reality. You have to understand the starting point.
Yeah, it's not a gentle introduction.
Not at all. The current consensus in a lot of archaeology is that huge parts of the Old Testament have, and I'm quoting from the source material here, roughly equivalent as historical credibility to Aesop's fables.
Wow. That is a brutal way to put it.
It is.
But it really does reflect decades of academic frustration. I mean, for archaeologists, for historians, the field has just been this story of a systematic failure to match the biblical accounts with what they're actually finding in the ground.
The classic conflict, right? The spade versus the scripture.
Precisely. And when you use the conventional timeline, the one that's been established for a century, the one based on the reigns of the pharaohs,
You find nothing.
you find nothing. No destroyed cities where they should be, no evidence of huge population movements. The patterns the Bible describes for the conquest, for the Exodus itself, they just aren't there.
So because of that absence, that void in the ground, the academic verdict became, well, pretty definitive.
Well, absolutely. And you saw really influential figures, especially in Israel, making these bold public statements. Rohl brings up the Israeli archaeologist, Professor Zeev Herzog from Tel Aviv University.
And what did he say?
Back in 1999, he stated, just point blank, that the Exodus was a story that never happened.
And that must have caused a huge stir.
It did. It caused a media uproar.
Oh.
But you have to see it from their perspective. From a purely scientific standpoint, if your data, your archaeological data from the established chronology, contradicts the text.
Then the text has to be wrong. It gets relegated to fiction.
Exactly. And the implication of that is just staggering. It means entire faith systems, moral codes, they would all be resting on what Rohl calls a fairy tale.
But that's where Rohl's core argument comes in. He's not saying the story is false. He's saying the timeline is false.
Right. The chronological framework that archaeology is using is fundamentally flawed, and it's forcing scholars to dig for evidence in completely the wrong century.
And the source of that error, he claims, is this rigid, unwavering acceptance of something called the Ramses theory.
And we really need to spend some time on this, because this theory is the absolute linchpin. It holds the entire conventional dating scheme together.
So why? Why have generations of scholars all agreed to place the Israelite slavery and the Exodus during the reign of Ramses II, the great 19th dynasty pharaoh?
It's almost unbelievable, but it hangs almost entirely on a single phrase, one little piece of linguistic evidence from the Book of Exodus.
It's just one.
Just one, Exodus 1.01. It names one of the supply cities that the Israelites were forced to build as Ramses.
Okay.
In Egyptian, that city was known as Pi-Ramses. And since we know for a fact that Ramses II built this magnificent new capital city in the eastern delta called Pi-Ramses,
The logic seemed unavoidable.
it seemed undeniable. Ramses II must be the pharaoh of the oppression. And just like that, you have a fixed date for the Exodus, right there in the 13th century BCE.
I am genuinely floored by that. The core historical proof for this entire narrative, for a century of archaeology, rests on the appearance of a single proper noun.
It seems flimsy, doesn't it? But, in the absence of other secure contemporary evidence, you go with the most logical interpretation. But this is exactly where literary scholars and Egyptologists, the people who study ancient writing, they step in and say, hold on a minute.
And they bring up what's called the redaction argument.
Yes. Okay, so unpack this for us, because this is where that solid anchor starts to look really, really shaky.
Okay. So redaction is basically just ancient editing. Professor James Hoffmeyer, who Rohl cites, he suggests that the name Ramesses is probably a later editorial update.
A common practice back then.
A very common practice. Think of it like this. If you were republishing an old book today, say from the 1800s, you might update old place names to make them recognizable to a modern audience. Ancient scribes did the exact same thing.
Okay, so give us an example.
All right, so an original, much older document might have named an older city in the Delta, a city like Avaris, where we know Semitic populations lived. But centuries later, maybe during the time of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, a scribe is copying this ancient text. He looks at the name Avaris and thinks, nobody knows where that is anymore.
But everyone knows Pyramus.
Everyone knows the great city of Pyramus. I'll just swap out the old name for the new one to keep the text geographically relevant for my readers.
So the name becomes an anachronism, a
Yes.
chronological fingerprint from a later time.
Exactly. It would place the building of the city during the time of Ramses II, even if the original event, the actual servitude, happened centuries earlier at a different site under a totally different pharaoh.
So if that theory is correct, if the name Ramesses is just a later editorial insertion,
Then the whole conventional dating scheme just collapses into thin air.
it really does. Rohl stresses this in the text. If you take away that one name, he says, nothing else in archaeology or contemporary documentation establishes that connection between Ramses II and the Israelite slaves.
So the fixed day, the 13th century BCE date that has driven all this archaeological searching.
It's entirely reliant on that one, potentially updated name. The Orthodox chronology is, well, it's built on sand.
It's just incredible. The whole thing hinges on that. But okay, even if that wasn't bad enough for the theory, we have actual, tangible evidence, right?
Yeah.
Something definitive like the Merneptah stele. And this just seems to dig the hole even deeper.
It really does. The Merneptah stele, which some people call the Israel stele, is a fascinating piece of the puzzle. It's a gigantic stone monument.
Erected by who?
By Pharaoh Merneptah, who was Ramses II's successor. And it's dated very precisely to the 5th year of his reign, which puts it right around the end of the 13th century BCE.
And when they found this, scholars must have been thrilled.
Oh, ecstatic. You've got this long, detailed Egyptian text perfectly preserved.
What was it for? What's the main point of the text?
Well, about 90% of it is bragging. It's commemorating a massive military victory. Merneptah had just successfully stopped a huge Libyan invasion and secured Egypt's borders.
Okay, but it's the end of the inscription that matters, right?
It's the very end. The last little bit, this abbreviated section, lists off a few other successful campaigns he conducted in Canaan.
And what's the phrase that sent shockwaves through the historical community?
It's this devastating, triumphant conclusion to his little campaign in Canaan. It says, Israel is devastated, its seed is no more.
Wow. So there it is, a clear Egyptian source, firmly dated, mentioning Israel by name.
It's massive. And on one hand, it's proof. It proves a group called Israel existed in Canaan during the New Kingdom. But this is where the proof of existence becomes a proof of contradiction for the Orthodox timeline.
How so?
Well, you have to look at the tiny little pictures, the hieroglyphs. They used to write the name Israel.
Determinatives.
Exactly, the determinatives. They're like little signposts that categorize the word. The Egyptian scribes used a very specific one next to the name Israel.
And what was it?
It's a combination of symbols, 2 small figures, a seated man and a seated woman, followed by 3 vertical strokes, which just means plural.
Okay, and what does that combination mean?
That combination is the standard Egyptian way of writing a nation, or a people, or a tribal group. And crucially, it is not the determinative they would have used for a city-state. That would have been marked completely differently.
So the stele confirms that by the end of the 13th century BCE, there was a known political entity or tribal group called Israel living in Canaan.
Yes, firmly after the supposed date of the Exodus, under the Ramses theory.
Yeah.
But also well before the traditional timing of the conquest described in the Bible.
And that's the critical chronological problem.
It's a huge problem. Because under the Orthodox chronology, the story is Exodus, then Joshua leads the conquest, which is supposed to be this sudden, widespread destruction of fortified Canaanite cities. That's what establishes Israel's presence.
But if Israel is already there, already established as a recognizable nation by Merneptah's 5th year,
then it completely undermines that traditional conquest story. It suggests Israel was already living in Canaan, maybe evolving gradually over time, not arriving in a sudden, violent invasion after leaving Egypt.
So the Merneptah stele, which at first seems like the smoking gun for Israel's existence, actually ends up confirming their existence at a time and in a status that contradicts the biblical history as it's written. It reinforces the dismissal.
And the problem gets even worse. It doesn't stop with the text. It becomes visually worse when you look at the archaeology that might be connected to it. And this brings us to what Rohl calls the shocking chariot paradox.
Okay, let's focus on this because this is a really compelling part of the argument. It moves us from just analyzing text to a clear visual contradiction.
So an Egyptologist named Frank Yurko, he proposed this really intriguing connection. He was looking at these damaged battle reliefs at the Temple of Karnak.
The huge temple complex.
That's the one. Most of the reliefs were from Ramses II's time.
Yeah.
But Yurko suggested they corresponded exactly to the list of places in the Merneptah poem. You know, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel.
Wow. So that would be a sensational discovery, visual evidence for a campaign against Israel.
Exactly. Archaeologists thought, finally, we have a picture of a battle against the nation of Israel.
So what does the picture show? What does this visual record actually depict?
The proposed fragment, the one that's supposed to be the battle against Israel, it shows an enemy chariot. Specifically, it's two men in a lightweight chariot, and they're fleeing from the Pharaoh's much more powerful forces.
Okay, so it confirms the enemy used chariots. Why is that a problem?
Because it creates this fundamental, completely irreconcilable conflict with the biblical record for that specific historical period.
Why? What did the Israelite army look like during the time of the conquest and the early judges, according to the Bible itself?
The biblical narrative is incredibly specific about this. The Israelite military was a tribal confederation of foot soldiers. They were what we'd call an infantry of guerrilla forces. They were hill fighters.
And they were strictly and deliberately lacking horses and chariots.
Yes, that's the key.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about them not being able to afford them. It was military policy.
It was a choice.
It was a choice, and maybe even a theological command. You see it laid out so clearly in the book of Joshua, chapter 11.
What happens there?
Joshua defeats this big coalition of northern kings, and they had a lot of chariots and horses. But Joshua isn't told to capture them and use them. He's explicitly instructed to cut the tendons of their horses and burn their chariots.
So they were actively destroying what was then the most powerful military technology in the world.
They were. And the reasons for that are probably twofold: tactical and theological.
How so?
Tactically, chariots are pretty much useless in the steep, rocky, central hill country of Canaan where the Israelites were settling. And theologically, relying on this expensive foreign military hardware might have been seen as a rejection of their reliance on God.
And when do chariots finally appear in the Israelite army?
Much, much later. The first time we can definitively say the Israelite army incorporates chariots is during the prosperous era of King Solomon, which is centuries after Merneptah.
Okay, so if Rohl's argument holds, the Orthodox dating presents this absolutely devastating contradiction.
It does.
Merneptah's stele proves Israel existed as a people, but the associated Karnak relief seems to show them using chariots. If that fleeing chariot belongs to the nation of Israel,
Then the archaeological visual record fundamentally contradicts the biblical description of the Israelite military at that time. It just reinforces the idea that the scripture is not a reliable historical account.
it's like a perfect storm of failure for the conventional timeline.
It really is. You have this very flimsy chronological anchor with the name Ramses. Then, when you finally find some solid material evidence, like the stele and the relief, it actively contradicts the military realities described in the very text you're trying to prove.
So it seems like every time the Orthodox chronology tries to find the Exodus or the conquest, the evidence they dig up either isn't there, or if it is there, it actively disproves the biblical account.
Which is what leads Rohl to his inevitable conclusion. The problem isn't the historical memory inside the biblical text. The problem is the flawed lens we're using to date those events, the Egyptian chronology itself.
So to truly test the biblical accounts,
You have to challenge the very foundation of the established Egyptian timeline.
and that brings us to the third critical problem, and maybe the most complex one, because it means challenging the one single, universally agreed upon synchronization point in all of ancient Near Eastern history.
The identification of Shishak.
Right. This point is so critical because it underpins the entire dating structure of the ancient world. For generations, this has been the absolute fixed point, linking Egyptian history directly to the history of Israel's united monarchy.
Okay, so who is Shishak in the Bible, and why is he so important?
The biblical text, you can find it in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. It records that a pharaoh named Shishak attacked Jerusalem and he plundered the Temple of Solomon.
And this was during the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam.
Right, just after the kingdom had split in two. And for over a century, who is Shishak identified as?
He was identified by the legendary Jean-François Champollion,
The man who deciphered the hieroglyphs?
the man himself. He identifies Shishak as Pharaoh Shoshenq I, who was the founder of Egypt's 22nd dynasty. And Shoshenq reigned right around 925 BCE.
And how did Champollion make that connection?
He was looking at these magnificent battle reliefs at the Temple of Karnak, and they list all the cities that Shoshenq captured in his campaign in the Levant. And on that list is the phrase Ayuda Hamalkuth,
Which means?
Judah, the kingdom.
Wow. Okay, that sounds pretty definitive. You have an Egyptian king, he records a campaign, he lists the kingdom of Judah, and the timing fits perfectly with the biblical story of Rehoboam.
Exactly. And that synchronization, Shoshenq I equals Shishak, around 925 BCE, that has been the non-negotiable anchor point for aligning all of Egyptian history with the history of Israel and Judah ever since.
It dictates all the dates for the earlier dynasties, the 18th and 19th, which is where everyone has been looking for the Exodus.
So if David Rohl wants to shift the timeline by hundreds of years, he has to break this one specific, universally accepted synchronization point.
And he does it by proposing something absolutely radical, that the biblical Shishak is actually Ramses II, the very same pharaoh who is conventionally identified as the pharaoh of the oppression.
I mean, how do you even make that leap from Shoshenq I all the way back to Ramses II?
This is where we have to dive into the really fascinating nitty-gritty world of phonetics and ancient nicknames and, well, scribal errors.
So Rohl's argument is that the conventional identification is just a big linguistic mistake.
Essentially, yes. A confusion that stems from how foreign names were written down and preserved over hundreds and hundreds of years.
Okay, let's start with Ramses II's nickname.
Right. So Ramses II, like all pharaohs, had this incredibly long royal name. But the people living in the Levant, the Canaanites and the Akkadian scribes, they used a shortened version, a nickname, a hypercasistic.
And what was that nickname?
His full name was Riamashisha, but it was often shortened to just Shisha or Sisa.
Okay, phonetically, that sounds very close to the biblical Shishak.
It's close. You have Shish W for Sisa versus Shish Q for Shishak. But that final letter, that hard Q sound at the end, that's the sticking point. Where did that come from if his nickname ended with a W sound?
And this is the absolute genius of Rohl's linguistic deep dive. He argues that this difference, this one letter, is the result of a scribal error, a mistake that we can actually pinpoint to a specific era.
Which era?
The period of intense biblical editing and copying, probably around the time of King Josiah in late 7th century BCE. You have these scribes who are trying to preserve texts that are already centuries old, written in scripts that were visually falling out of use.
So we're talking about the transition from the ancient pictorial script, the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, to the later Paleo-Hebrew script.
Precisely. And that transition is the crucial moment where the chronological error gets baked in the ancient archaic script that might have been used for the original account of the sack of Jerusalem.
So an eyewitness account from the time of Rehoboam?
Potentially, yes. In that script, the sign for the letter Wa, which makes a WE sound, and was used in Ramses' nickname Sis, was graphically, visually, almost identical to the sign for the later Hebrew letter Qaf, which makes a Q sound.
Oh, wow. So you have to imagine a scribe in the 7th century BCE. He's looking at this ancient, maybe fading manuscript. The original text says that King Rehoboam was attacked by Pharaoh Sis.
Right. And this scribe, he's using the visual cues of his own contemporary Hebrew alphabet. And he sees this character at the end of the name that looks exactly like the letter Qaf to him.
So he misreads it.
That's the proposed mechanism of the error. The redactor misreads the visually similar ancient sign for Wa as the letter Qaf, and he writes down the name as Shishak. Shush. The text gets updated, but in that moment, a massive chronological error gets embedded into the historical record.
Hold on a minute. Rohl is resting a potential 350-year shift in the entire history of the ancient Near East, a displacement that would completely restructure the foundations of archaeology, on the possibility that a scribe misread two letters that looked similar.
It sounds incredibly circumstantial when you put it like that.
How convincing do scholars actually find that leap?
Well, it's a huge leap, but Rohl points out that this kind of graphical shift and scribal error is a known feature of how texts get transmitted over long periods of time. It's hypothesis for sure, but it's one that explains a massive, massive problem with a tiny, plausible mechanism.
And if you accept even the possibility of that error.
If you accept that Ramses II is the true Shishak, then the entire 19th dynasty has to be placed about 350 years earlier than conventionally accepted.
That is a profound implication. If Shishak is Ramses II, then the entire conventional Egyptian chronology is just fundamentally flawed. The domino effect is it's catastrophic for the Orthodox dating.
It creates a massive displacement. It pushes all the New Kingdom pharaohs back centuries into the timeline. And if the 19th dynasty moves back that far, where does that put the Exodus?
Suddenly, you're not looking in the 13th century BCE anymore. You're looking much, much earlier.
And that, in Rohl's view, is what solves the mystery of the archaeological gap. The reason archaeologists found no evidence for the Exodus or the conquest in the 13th and 14th centuries BCE
is because it didn't happen then. It happened centuries before in an era they weren't even looking at. They were digging in the right place, but using a massively incorrect chronological clock.
Precisely. The problem was never the Bible's historical kernel. It was the flawed chronological structure that forced scholars to look in the wrong era. An error rooted in a likely redaction, compounded by a single scribal mistake over the confusion between a wa and a quaff.
It's fascinating how technical this all gets. We went from Herzog's sweeping dismissal of the entire Bible to analyzing tiny determinatives on a stele and comparing the shapes of two letters in an archaic script.
And it all points back to that one question. If we shift the entire timeline, where does the Exodus land, and what evidence finally pops up to support it?
So Rohl has basically established that the Orthodox chronology has failed. Repeatedly. The Ramses dating failed because of the redaction problem.
The Merneptah stele introduced fatal contradictions, both textually and visually.
And the Shishak linchpin, the one solid connection, is demonstrably weak because of this potential scribal transposition. So Rohl just eliminates all the other academic possibilities as well, right? The early date theories also collapse.
Yes. Under archaeological scrutiny, they don't hold up either, which leaves only one possibility left on the table if you want to reconcile the history and the scripture.
And that is to place the Exodus squarely in the Middle Bronze Age, hundreds of years before the New Kingdom pharaohs we usually think of.
But to prove that, to make that case, Rohl now have to provide the evidence. He has to show compelling archaeological finds that align with the biblical narrative, but only once the chronology has been revised. And that, of course, is the subject of the rest of his book.
Okay, so let's just bring all this together and summarize what we've learned from this deep dive into the creation of a myth. The Orthodox view, the idea that the Exodus is a myth, it gained all this traction and it dominated academia because of three huge problems. And all of them stem from this rigid dating of the events to the time of Ramses II.
Right. First, the core dating hangs by a thread. The single word Ramses, which Rohl argues is almost certainly a later editorial update, a geographical retcon, not a secure historical marker from the time.
So, no secure historical anchor.
None. Second, the Merneptah stele and the Karnak relief, when you look at them through the Orthodox timeline, they present this fundamental military contradiction.
You have Israel existing as a recognized nation, but with visual evidence showing them using chariots, a military asset the biblical text explicitly commands them to avoid and destroy during that very period.
And finally, the critical chronological anchor of Shishak, that first crucial link between the Egyptian and Hebrew timelines, it's possibly flawed due to a simple scribal error, confusing the ancient letters wa and quaf.
And if Rohl is correct about that one error, the entire framework we use to date the ancient world is offset by about 3.5 centuries.
The conclusion of this first part is really clear. We can't just blindly trust the conventional Egyptian chronology if we're looking for historical patterns that align with the Old Testament.
A radical revision, what Rohl calls a new chronology, is necessary just to move the conversation forward from dismissal to potential discovery.
He successfully argues that the academic rejection of the Exodus isn't based on a lack of historical events. It's based on the systematic misdating of those events. He's essentially created this significant chronological vacuum.
And that pivot point, that's what sets us up for the next stage of this incredible journey. Having shown that the Orthodox framework is likely wrong, the next parts of our deep dive, drawing from the rest of Rohl's work, are going to look at the evidence he presents for shifting the Exodus into the Middle Bronze Age.
It's going to be fascinating. We'll look at the astonishing archaeological correlations he identifies I mean, potential evidence for the biblical Joseph during Egypt's 12th dynasty, the specific pharaohs involved, even natural causes for the plagues found in Egyptian sources.
And the proposed geographically viable route of the Israelites out of Egypt. It's going to be a journey to try and find the historical reality that might be hiding behind the legend. Which leaves us with this final thought. If the entire historical framework we use to date events is off by hundreds of years, what other foundational historical narratives might we need to completely reassess? Is this just a scholarly dispute over dates, or is it a complete reconstruction of the ancient world? Stay tuned for our deep dive into the historical reality behind the legend.
Continuing with the analysis, we will now discuss the incredible quest to find the historical pattern behind the biblical narrative of the Exodus, focusing intently on the period of the Israelites' stay in Egypt and the dramatic events of their departure.
Right.
This is a story that, for decades, has been largely dismissed by modern mainstream archaeology. And really, it's because the conventional timing it failed to deliver the evidence. But what if we've been looking in the wrong era entirely?
And that is the absolute core of the argument we're digging into today. I mean, the traditional dating, the one you see in movies, it places the Exodus under Ramses II.
Right, the big, powerful pharaoh, 19th dynasty, late Bronze Age.
Exactly. But when archaeologists look at that period, they just don't see it. They find a powerful, stable Egyptian empire. There's no catastrophic collapse, no evidence of a mass movement of people on the biblical scale.
Nothing matches up.
Nothing. And that failure to align is precisely what compels us to shift our focus much, much earlier, back to the turbulent period of the Middle Bronze Age, specifically the late 12th and the 13th dynasties, where the source material we're looking at argues a far stronger, almost unavoidable correlation exists.
So our mission in this deep dive isn't just to summarize this radical alternative theory. We want to really pressure test the claims, both archaeological and textual, that place the Sojourn and the Exodus nearly 300 years earlier than we've been taught.
And we have to break it down. You can't just look at it as one big event.
Well, absolutely. We're looking for hard, specific evidence across 4 critical phases. So first, can we actually prove the viability of Joseph's administration? Is there physical evidence of that specific famine?
Then second, can we track the growth of this Semitic community in the Egyptian Delta and that painful shift into slavery?
Right. And third, and this is a big one, is there any non-biblical corroboration for the plagues, for Egypt's total collapse?
And finally, the climax of the story. We have to evaluate the geography. Is the Exodus route plausible? What about the miracle at the sea?
We're going deep into the dirt and the documents to see if this Middle Bronze Age theory holds water.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning of the Sojourn. The story of Joseph is, at its heart, an economic and an environmental story. You've got 7 years of this incredible abundance, followed by 7 years of a devastating famine.
And that's the catalyst. That's what brings Jacob and his entire family into Egypt.
Exactly. So the core claim here, the one that really anchors this entire revised chronology, is that this specific 14-year environmental cycle lines up perfectly with events that were documented during the reign of one specific pharaoh, Amenemhat III, in the late 12th dynasty.
Right.
So how can we possibly connect a biblical story to a pharaoh based on, of all things, environmental data?
It's because of the Egyptians' absolutely extraordinary, almost obsessive archival maintenance, specifically the Nile River records.
They tracked everything.
Everything. The pharaoh's entire economy, their entire civilization, depended on the Nile's annual inundation, the flood. And so deep south in Nubia, at this narrow gorge called Semna and Kuma, scribes would meticulously carve the peak flood level for that year right into the cliff walls.
So these aren't just estimates from some papyrus. These are physical measurements.
They are physical, hard data points carved in stone, taken over centuries. It's an incredible record.
So what do these stone carvings, these measurements, tell us about the time of Amenemhat III? Let's start with the years of plenty.
Okay, so they establish a very clear baseline. Over the long haul, the average ideal flood, the one that guaranteed a great harvest, was about 23 cubits.
Which is roughly, what, in modern terms?
About 12 meters. But then, for a period of about 17 years, starting very early in Amenemhat III's reign, around his year 3, something changes.
Okay.
The Nile consistently, year after year, peaked at 32 cubits. That's nearly 17 meters.
Wait, hold on. That's a 5-meter surge? No, a 4.5-meter surge above the average.
Yeah.
And that was sustained for almost 2 decades.
17 years.
What does that kind of sustained higher than normal flood actually do for farming?
It is the literal definition of fartura, the Hebrew word for abundance used in the biblical text. It's not just that it watered the fields reliably. That 4.5-meter surge brought an immense volume of rich, fertile silt.
So it's not just water, it's fertilizer.
The best fertilizer on the planet. And it dramatically increased the amount of arable land in the Nile Valley. I mean, you have to imagine fields that were normally just desert fringe suddenly becoming prime agricultural territory. This mirrors the biblical description perfectly, where the land yielded so much that Joseph's stockpiles exceeded any ability to calculate them.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for the years of plenty and overabundance of good flooding. But the next stage is the famine. And, we're all taught that famine in the ancient world means drought. A lack of water.
Right.
Do the records at Semna confirm a drought?
And this is where the historical record is so fascinating because it's completely counterintuitive. It also shows why Joseph's specific administrative genius was so necessary. The records confirm a disaster struck, yes, but it was the exact opposite of a drought.
So too much water.
Way too much water. In Amenemhat III's year 20, the peak flood levels soared to a terrifying 41 cubits.
41, that's... what, 21 meters?
21 meters. That's 9 meters above the average. It represents 4 times the normal volume of water hitting the valley.
I can't even picture that. That's not a flood, that's a cataclysm. A 9-meter surge above the ideal flood turns the entire agricultural heartland into an inland sea.
That's exactly what happened. We're talking about an overwhelming, prolonged flood that just swept through the valley. The sources we have detail the devastation. I mean, livestock drowning, entire villages wiped out. But the crucial point for the famine is that it fundamentally disrupted the agricultural cycle. Well, the floodwater stayed on the land for far, far too long. Normally, the water recedes, the ground dries, and you can plow and plant. But here, the land was just waterlogged for months on end.
So you can't even get the seeds in the ground.
You can't even attempt the harvest. A drought leaves the land tillable but barren. An overwhelming, prolonged flood like this one prevents you from doing anything at all.
So the environmental crisis that demanded Joseph's intervention wasn't nature withholding its bounty, but a surplus so immense it just paralyzed the whole system. Yeah. And how long do the records say this crisis lasted?
The records from Semna suggest a period of this high water crisis lasting for up to 12 years, which strongly overlaps with the biblical 7 years of devastating famine. This type of disaster required exactly what the Bible describes: a centralized, visionary administration to manage the grain that was already stockpiled, to control water where possible, and to distribute food.
Which moves us from climate data to, well, engineering.
To concrete engineering, yes.
If Joseph was an administrator of this caliber, managing a crisis of this scale, he has to be connected to the massive infrastructure projects of that era. And Amenemhat III is famous for one in particular.
He is. He initiated one of the greatest water diversion and control projects in ancient history, and it was designed specifically to mitigate these huge floods and store water for leaner times. This colossal structure is known even today by a very, very suggestive name.
Bar Yusuf.
The Canal of Joseph.
Okay, let's pause there. That's a direct link, a name that exists outside of the biblical text itself. Is there any serious debate that the Bar Yusuf was primarily a flood control project from this specific rain?
No serious debate on that at all. The entire project was about diverting excess water from the Nile at a place called Asut and channeling it hundreds of kilometers into the vast Fayum Basin.
Creating a huge artificial lake.
A gigantic reservoir, often called Lake Morris. The estimates say it was 4 times the size of the modern Birket Karun. It was a monumental feat of engineering. And Amenemhat III was so proud of it, he built his pyramid at Hawara, specifically overlooking this canal system.
A monument to his or his vizier's life-saving project.
Exactly. And the fact that this great engineering feat has been associated with the name Joseph for millennia, preserved by local tradition, well, it lends powerful circumstantial weight to this theory.
Okay, so who was the official in charge? If this administrator was active during that crisis at the end of the 12th dynasty, does the historical record offer a candidate? A name?
It does. The source material we're looking at links Joseph to a figure known as the Vizier Anku.
Anku?
Yes. Vizier Anku is very well attested, especially during that unstable transition into the early 13th dynasty that followed. It's entirely plausible that his time as the supreme administrator began during those critical years at the end of the 12th dynasty, which is exactly when the famine relief efforts would have been at their peak.
And he wasn't just some bureaucrat.
No, far from it. He was a figure of immense renown who was later venerated almost like a saint. This level of honor fits the biblical description of Joseph perfectly. A man who essentially saved Egypt and was granted unprecedented authority by the pharaoh.
So we have the time, the crisis, the project, and a potential historical figure. Now we need the place.
Yes.
The Israelites were settled in Goshen in the eastern delta, and Joseph, as this powerful administrator, would have been based near the capital there. The archaeological focus is on Evris, modern Tel Adaba.
Right.
What did the Austrian excavations there, led by Manfred Bietak, uncover about a powerful Semitic figure in Evris?
This is, for me, the most specific and just astonishing part of the evidence. In a section of Everest called Area F, in a layer they call Stratum G, the excavators found a major palace complex. But what's critical is what it was built on.
Okay.
It was built directly over the ruins of a much smaller, much earlier structure, a type of house known as a Middle Saal house.
What is a Middle Saal house, and why does its location matter so much?
So, Middle Saal house literally translates to middle hall house. It's a style of home with a big central main room and smaller chambers around it. It's typical of the early settlement structures used by those incoming Semitic populations.
So, the first house is built by Jacob and his family.
Precisely. The fact that this later massive palace was built directly on top of the ruins of one of these simple Semitic dwellings strongly suggests a lineage connection. It implies that the powerful official who built the palace was descended from the person who lived in that first modest home.
And the palace itself, did it have any distinct features?
It did. The palace had a portico, a grand entrance, supported by exactly 12 columns. 12. Now, this could just be architecture, of course, but given the context, this palace being built over the original Semitic house, it's very strongly interpreted as representing the 12 sons of Jacob, the foundational tribal structure of the Israelite community.
That's highly circumstantial, I grant you, but it's powerful. The real centerpiece, though, was found behind the palace, the funerary complex. Tell us about that.
Right. Behind the palace, the excavators found a funerary complex that was just highly unusual for an official. It included a mud brick pyramid.
A pyramid for an official.
Yes. And you have to understand, in the Egyptian history of this period, the late 12th and 13th dynasties, using a pyramid, even a mud brick one, was a privilege reserved exclusively for kings and queens, maybe a highly favored royal wife.
So to grant this honor to an official, especially a foreign Asiatic official,
it was utterly unprecedented. It indicates supreme royal appreciation, the highest honor the pharaoh could possibly bestow.
So what did they find inside this royal-level tomb?
Well, the attached chapel once housed a colossal seated statue. It was larger than life-size, and although they only found it in fragments, the details were explicit.
What did they show?
This figure was definitely Asiatic. He was depicted with yellow skin, which was the standard Egyptian artistic convention for representing people from Asia or Canaan. He had a very distinctive red, mushroom-shaped Asiatic hairstyle, and in his hand he carried a throwing stick, another symbol frequently associated with Asiatics in Egyptian art.
And then there's the detail that just seems to leap right off the page of the Bible.
Yes. The fragments of the statue still had faint traces of paint on the figure's cloak, and they suggest it was patterned with vertical stripes.
The coat of many colors.
Now, obviously, it's not definitive proof, but when you combine it with everything else, the Asiatic features, the supreme honor of the pyramid, the location in Everest, the 12 columns, the visual link to Joseph's famous coat is very, very hard to ignore.
So we have an Asiatic official, honored beyond measure, associated with a striped cloak, ruling from a palace built over a patriarch's house in Goshen. But the final, and maybe the most pivotal piece of evidence, is the state of the burial chamber itself.
Yes. The burial chamber, deep beneath the pyramid, was empty.
Robbers.
That's the crucial point. It was clearly not due to tomb robbers. Robbers are after gold, precious metals, grave goods, and those were all still present in the complex. The body itself had been carefully and deliberately removed. This strongly suggests what archaeologists call a pious act of removal, the exact event described in the biblical text, where Moses takes the bones of Joseph with the Israelites when they finally leave Egypt. The evidence just paints this incredibly cohesive and specific picture that locates Joseph's time and his legacy precisely at the end of the 12th dynasty in Everest.
Okay, so that establishes the sojourn. The family of Jacob arrives, they're prosperous, they're settled in Goshen, which we've identified with the eastern delta around Everest.
Known to the Egyptians as Gesemet, it was perfect for their pastoral, nomadic lifestyle, even as they adapted to life in the delta.
So what does the archaeology tell us about the initial size and the culture of this immigrant community?
Well, the data from Everest confirms the narrative's initial scale and timing perfectly. The demographic shift, this rapid influx of Semitic peoples from the northeast, it begins exactly in the Middle Bronze DCIA period.
Which is our revised timeline for Jacob's arrival.
Exactly. And the early community was small. Initial estimates put the population at around 70 to 100 people, living in maybe a couple dozen of those middle saw houses.
That aligns almost exactly with the biblical count of 70 souls arriving with Jacob.
It's an uncanny alignment.
And their cultural footprint. Did they immediately become Egyptian?
Not at all. The early settlement, that Stratum G and Everest, was highly distinctive. It was surprisingly egalitarian, which reflects their pastoral origins. The houses, as we said, had these large living rooms and smaller side chambers, but also, and this was crucial to their lifestyle, vast open courtyards.
For their animals.
For livestock and for large storage silos. It reflects a nomadic, livestock-focused way of life, just adapted for the fertile delta. And life was good. Thanks to Joseph's position, the community grew very, very rapidly, fueled by high birth rates internally and a continuous flow of other Semites coming from Canaan to escape environmental stress.
But that initial prosperity gives way to the central trauma of the Exodus story: oppression and enslavement. When did this fundamental shift in status, from favored guests and administrators to subjugated slaves, begin to happen in the historical record?
The pivot point seems to be the catastrophic political instability after the death of the last powerful 12th dynasty ruler, Amenemhat IV. This ushers in the 13th dynasty, which is just chaos, weak leadership, and this dizzying succession of short-reigning kings. Some of them only ruled for a few months.
So this power vacuum was the key.
It was. Instability at the top created an opportunity for the Semitic officials, the descendants of Joseph, to gain a huge amount of control.
So they rose even higher initially.
Precisely. They soared, but only for a short time. These Asian officials, often working through a powerful council, effectively ran the Delta. They sometimes even dictated which short-lived pharaoh would sit on the throne.
But that was a fragile situation.
Yeah. Extremely brittle. The native Egyptians were already wary of foreign influence, and they soon struck back. By the time you get to rulers like Sebekotep III, the political tides had completely turned, and the status of the entire Semitic population began its dramatic decline.
They went from being honored administrators to
being seen as a large, potentially subversive foreign population, ripe for exploitation and subjugation.
And do we have historical documentation that confirms this widespread subjugation, not just the Bible?
We do. We have an invaluable document known as the Brooklyn Papyrus. Its inventory number is 35.1446, and it's essentially a household ledger. It lists all the servants on a single private Egyptian estate.
Okay, so a kind of ancient spreadsheet.
A very detailed one. And what's so striking is the makeup of this estate's workforce. Out of a list of 79 people, at least 45 of them have Semitic names.
Wow. So more than half. Why is a simple household ledger, surviving for 3,500 years so important to this theory?
Because it's empirical, non-biblical proof of mass Semitic integration into the Egyptian labor pool. And not as honored guests, but as property. It confirms that the wide-scale subjugation of this population had already begun long before the Bible describes the forced labor building the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses.
And the names themselves, you said some of them link directly to the Exodus narrative.
Yes, and the parallels are chilling. The list includes names like Menahem, Asher, and Issachar, all names associated with the later tribes of Israel.
Okay.
But the most compelling one is the name Shiphrah.
Shiphrah. That's the name of one of the Hebrew midwives.
The exact name. One of the two midwives commanded by Pharaoh in the book of Exodus to kill all the male Hebrew infants. To find that specific, uncommon name in a record of Semitic servitude, dating precisely to the time when this subjugation was ramping up. It's a tremendous circumstantial link. It suggests the enslavement was already deeply entrenched and organized.
This dark political atmosphere brings us to the figure of Moses. He was raised in the court, but his actions eventually force him to flee. Which pharaoh was on the throne when all this happened?
This would align with the reign of Sebekotep IV, another one of these unstable 13th dynasty rulers. The sources we're examining make it clear that Moses, despite not being of royal blood, was immensely popular.
A man of the people.
And a military hero. Historical accounts, including from the Jewish historian Josephus, and even recorded on Sebekotep IV's own stele, tell of Moses leading a military force that repelled a devastating Cushite invasion.
Cushite meaning Ethiopian.
Yes, an invasion that was threatening Memphis, the very heart of Egypt.
So Moses was a war hero. He saved Egypt from a major threat. How on earth did that make him a threat to the pharaoh?
Because that heroic victory made him an immediate and profound political liability for Sebekatep IV. You have this man, not of royal blood, who now commands the loyalty of the army and the affection of the populace. His standing was just too great for a non-royal.
A potential rival to the throne.
A huge rival. So the subsequent murder of the Egyptian taskmaster, which Moses committed while defending a Hebrew slave, was really just the final catalyst, the excuse Pharaoh needed. He didn't just want to punish a crime. He wanted to eliminate a dangerously popular political opponent.
And that leads to Moses' 40 years in the desert, safely out of Egypt's reach.
He fled to the land of Midian, which the source material locates in the southern Sinai region, specifically around the traditional Mount Sinai, Gebel Musa. It's crucial this area was safely outside direct Egyptian control.
And it was habitable.
Yes, uniquely so. It was supplied with natural springs and wells, making it excellent pasture land. This geographical stability is vital. It explains how Moses could survive and mature for 40 years as a shepherd, preparing for his return without starving or being easily captured by Egyptian patrols.
So 40 years pass. Moses returns, ready to confront the pharaoh. If the sojourn started at the end of the 12th dynasty and the enslavement began in the mid-13th, who was the unfortunate king on the throne at the end of all this? Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus?
The revised chronology identifies the pharaoh of the Exodus as Dudimos. Sometimes he's referred to as Tutmosis. He was a king from the very, very end of the 13th dynasty. And this timing is critical.
Why?
Because it ties the Exodus not just to a period of instability, but to the final moment of collapse for Middle Kingdom authority in the Delta.
And what catastrophic event happens in the historical record immediately after the Exodus?
The invasion of the Hyksos.
The foreign rulers.
Yes. Manetho, the Egyptian historian, recounts that during the time of this Tutmosis, God wounded the Egyptians right before the overwhelming invasion of the people of obscure race, the Hyksos, who then violently took control of the Delta. This link is vital because for the Hyksos invasion to succeed, Egypt had to have been left defenseless.
Which brings us right back to the Sea of Reeds. The destruction of the Egyptian army during the Exodus must have been the event that left Egypt vulnerable.
That's the argument. The source material highlights that Dudimos' own son, a man named Konsumwasit, was the commander of the chariotry.
The elite fighting force.
The most elite unit. It is highly plausible that this royal heir led the entire Egyptian chariot force in pursuit of the Israelites, and that this entire unit was destroyed at the Sea of Reeds. This catastrophic loss of military command and strength would have created the exact power vacuum needed for the Hyksos, who were already gathering strength in the Levant, to just sweep into the Delta unopposed.
Okay, let's turn to the plagues themselves. The Exodus narrative describes this rapid succession of escalating catastrophes. Water to blood, pestilence, darkness, mass death. Does any non-biblical Egyptian record from this specific period document a nation going through that kind of profound chaos?
Yes. There is an incredible piece of Egyptian literature known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer.
I've heard of this. It's a lamentation.
It's a lamentation composed by an Egyptian sage named Ipuwer who lived through a period of utter social and environmental collapse. And its contents are just eerily congruent with the biblical narrative of the plagues. The document is essentially the eyewitness testimony of an elite Egyptian watching his entire world come to an end.
So let's pull out the most powerful specific parallels between what Ipuwer wrote and the plagues. Starting with the first one, the water contamination.
Ipuwer describes the situation in visceral detail. He laments, and I'm quoting here, "The river is blood." He also reports pestilence throughout the land, blood everywhere. This isn't just poetic license. It points to a catastrophic, widespread contamination of the Nile, their primary water source, leading to massive illness and death. It's exactly what the biblical narrative describes.
What about the destruction of the land and the famine that resulted? Not the high water famine Joseph managed, but one caused by destruction.
Ipuwer confirms it. He states, "Finished is the abundance of grain. Food stocks are short. Nobles suffer hunger." This mirrors the specific detail in Exodus that the plague of hail destroyed crops like barley and flax, which were key staples.
And when the nobles are starving.
It means a complete breakdown of infrastructure. Even the insulated elite are affected.
And the most dramatic visual plague, the 3 days of darkness. Anything there?
The papyrus provides a very strong textual echo. Ipuwer writes, "Those who had shelter are now in the darkness of the storm. The delta cannot be seen."
The delta cannot be seen.
Right. Whether you interpret that as a massive dust storm or maybe the ash from a volcanic eruption somewhere, the sage is clear. a profound, overwhelming darkness descended, and it paralyzed all movement and activity across the critical delta region.
Which brings us to the most devastating event, the final plague, the death of the firstborn. How does Ipuwer describe this period of national trauma?
This is where the accounts become almost indistinguishable. Ipuwer states, chillingly, "Behold, the plague sweeps the land, blood everywhere, and the dead are abundant. Children are dashed against the walls."
That's horrifying.
It is. And then he describes the emotional trauma, noting that he who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. This blending of widespread sudden death and the resulting national mourning, it matches the biblical narrative perfectly. Death spanning from the pharaoh's own heir down to the son of the captive in the dungeon, hitting every single Egyptian household at once.
It paints this terrifying picture of a society just collapsing under a biological and environmental assault. And what about the final moment? The Exodus itself involved the Israelites demanding and receiving wealth from their terrified Egyptian neighbors before they left.
Ipuwer corroborates that too, that immediate social upheaval. He laments the complete inversion of the social order, reporting that, quote, "foreign slaves are disposing of their master's goods."
Wow.
It directly corresponds to the Israelites plundering, or as the text says, borrowing, Egyptian wealth upon their urgent departure. The congruence between the admonitions of Ipuwer and the biblical narrative is just. It provides a powerful textual anchor for a historical catastrophe happening right at the end of the 13th dynasty.
So beyond the texts, the physical archaeology and avarice, the heart of the Semitic population, should reflect this. A sudden, overwhelming catastrophe and a rapid departure. What did BTAC's team find in the ground?
The archaeological findings are grim, but they're very specific. The Austrian excavators found multiple shallow pits in the Semitic quarter of Avaris, specifically in a layer they call stratum E3D1.
And these weren't regular graves.
No, not at all. These were mass graves. The bodies had been, in the words of the archaeologists, simply thrown in. There were no grave goods, no proper funerary orientation. Some were on their backs, some on their stomachs or on their sides. This profound haste, this disrespect for all burial customs, it indicates a sudden, overwhelming calamity that completely shattered their social structures.
A crisis of that magnitude suggests a very rapid, virulent disease.
That was the conclusion of the excavation director himself, Manfred BTAC. He confirmed these people died from a deadly, virulent plague, not just general mortality. What's more, other documents from that era refer to such an outbreak as the Asiatic disease.
Specifically associated with the Semitic population.
Yes, centered in Avaris. It suggests that the final devastating plague was likely something like a hemorrhagic fever, or another contagion that just ripped through the densely populated Semitic quarter before overwhelming the rest of the Egyptian population.
And after this horrific mass death event, what happened to that part of the city?
The archaeological record is definitive. The entire Semitic quarter was suddenly and completely emptied. The houses were abandoned. But, and this is key, they were not destroyed.
So they weren't burned down or attacked?
Exactly. It suggests the population left rapidly but deliberately, not because of a military assault. This is perfectly consistent with the immediate departure ordered right after the Passover on the 15th day of the first month. The combination of Ipuwer's lament, the mass graves, and the sudden abandonment provides powerful confirmation that the Exodus took place at the very moment the 13th dynasty collapsed.
So the Israelites have been delivered by this catastrophe, and now they depart Avaris. The biblical text lays out a very specific route. What were the initial checkpoints, and what was the intended logical direction of their travel?
Okay, so they leave Avaris, or Ramesses, as it was later called. Their first camp is at a place called Sukkoth,
which we can identify today.
Yes, it's identified linguistically and geographically with Tel El Maskuta. The name fits the Hebrew word Sukkot, which means temporary dwellings or booths.
Makes sense for a first camp. Where to next?
Their second camp was at Etham. This is likely the Egyptian frontier post known as Katem, which guarded the western entrance to the main road into Canaan.
The main military highway. So the logical, direct path from there would have been straight northeast into Canaan.
Precisely. They would have taken the way of Shur, which is the northern Sinai coastal route, but the Bible states explicitly that God directed them away from that road.
Why?
Because they might change their minds and return to Egypt when they face war. That road was fortified.
Okay, so instead of the direct route, the text describes this crucial reversal. The Hebrew word is shub. They were told to turn back, moving away from that path to this impossible-sounding location. Pi-Haroth, between Migdol and the sea, facing a place called Baal-Zephon. Why on earth force them into a dead end?
The reversal was a strategic trap, but not for them. It was for Pharaoh. By turning back away from the logical escape route, they would appear to be lost, confused.
Entangled in the land, as the Bible says.
Exactly. Pharaoh, seeing this, would assume they were cornered and vulnerable. It would justify the immense risk of launching his elite chariot force in pursuit. The goal was to lure the Egyptian army to their own destruction, and by doing so, secure long-term freedom for the Israelites.
This all hinges on correctly identifying the body of water the Bible calls Yam Suf. Popular culture, Cecil B. DeMille depicts this massive, deep ocean like the Gulf of Aqaba, which makes the event a huge miracle, but one that is scientifically impossible if you use the mechanism the Bible itself gives, the wind. The source material we're using pushes for a much different, more localized interpretation.
It does, and it's a critical point. Yam Suf translates literally as Sea of Reeds, and the argument is that it referred to the complex system of shallow, reedy lakes that formed the frontier zone along the eastern delta.
Not the deep sea.
Not the deep sea. Specifically, it's identified with the Lake of Horus system, particularly the Bala Lakes. And in ancient times, this area was known as Pachuf, a name that aligns perfectly with the word for reed, Suf.
Let's just reiterate why the Gulf of Aqaba is ruled out based on the biblical mechanism itself.
The Gulf of Aqaba reaches depths of 2,500 feet. No sustained wind, no matter how strong, can push back that volume of water to create dry ground. Not in a way that allows a huge population to cross before it all slams back. If you want to believe in the conventional deep-sea location, you have to reject the physical mechanism described in the text.
But if you accept the mechanism the text gives you, the strong east wind, then you have to look for a shallow body of water.
You must. The two go hand in hand.
So let's anchor those specific biblical place names, Pi-Hahiroth, Migdol, Baal-zephon, within this shallow lake geography. Where were they?
They were positioned right along that elaborate fortified system that protected Egypt's eastern border, the walls of the ruler. Pi-Hahiroth is identified as the mouth of the canals near modern Tel Abu Sefa, where the frontier canal system emptied into these shallow lakes.
And Migdol.
Migdol is identified as a significant fortress site known as T211, located just east of the main frontier line. And Baal-zephon, named after the Canaanite storm god Baal, was likely a major temple site at Tel Tafana.
So the Israelites were completely boxed in by these fortifications. They had the shallow sea, the lake system to their east. They had the Migdol fortress to their northeast, the Mediterranean beyond that, and the most powerful army on earth closing in from the west.
It was the perfect trap. Their only escape was through the water. And this brings us back to the explicit description of the miracle. The biblical account doesn't rely on some vague, magical splitting of the deep. It specifies the mechanism.
The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind that blew all night long.
Exactly. The cause is stated.
So does this natural mechanism actually hold up for a shallow, reedy lake like Pachuf?
Absolutely. The mechanism is geographically and scientifically plausible. For a body of water that's relatively shallow, like the Bala Lakes, a sustained, strong east wind blowing all night long would create something called a wind set-down effect.
Wind set-down.
Yes. The wind could realistically push that mass of water back, potentially exposing up to 11 kilometers of muddy lake bed, temporarily creating a path to cross. This is it's a remarkable, but it's a naturally occurring phenomenon that has been observed in shallow bodies of water in that region.
That distinction is so crucial. It changes the nature of the miracle. It wasn't a scientifically impossible event that suspended the laws of physics over a deep ocean. It was a timely and specific use of a rare, high-impact natural event over a shallow lake, timed perfectly by Providence to save one group and destroy another.
Exactly. The water was shallow enough for the wind to manipulate it, but deep enough to destroy the returning army once that wind dropped and the water rushed back. The destruction of the pursuit force wasn't because the water was impossibly deep. It was because of the speed and suddenness of the water's return, coupled with the miring effect of the wet mud on the heavy Egyptian chariots and infantry.
And the ultimate implication of this shallow water crossing: it secured their freedom. It destroyed the greatest military threat on Earth at the time, allowing them to proceed, unopposed, into the Sinai Peninsula.
That destruction was the critical military and political event. It confirms that the destruction of the chariotry, likely led by Dudimos' son, was the precise event that provided the indispensable window for the Hyksos to move in and finally end the 13th dynasty. The Exodus, therefore, wasn't some minor inconvenience for Egypt. It was the final, devastating blow that led directly to their own political subjugation.
This has been an incredibly detailed and, I think, compelling deep dive into the Middle Bronze Age theory of the Exodus. We've traced the circumstantial evidence linking Joseph's story to Amenhotep III and that massive Fayum water project, establishing the period of the sojourn through documented Nile flood levels.
Right, and we followed that archaeological trail in Avaris. We detailed the growth of the Semitic community, the evidence of their enslavement in the Brooklyn Papyrus, and then the undeniable physical reality of the final collapse, the mass graves and the sudden, deliberate abandonment that corresponds to the plagues and the departure under Pharaoh Dudamos. This new chronological framework just succeeds in providing historical validation where the conventional timeframe consistently failed.
And finally, the geography for the Yam Suf crossing is no longer a fantastical myth, but a highly localized, scientifically credible event centered on those shallow Bowel lakes, parted by a strong east wind that perfectly fits the biblical text's own description of the mechanism.
It really does.
The profound trauma and the deliverance of this period marked by those mass graves and the plague, followed by the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, this became the foundational story of the Israelites. It's what they've celebrated for millennia as the Passover.
And you should reflect on how understanding the precise localized geography with the wind as the catalyst really reframes the event. Does knowing the physical reality of the Bala Lakes make this pivotal moment in history more or less miraculous? It was a deliverance that hinged on perfect timing, on natural forces, and on the catastrophic political vacuum that followed in its wake.
This account of the Exodus set the stage for the creation of the Israelite nation. But what happens next? I mean, how does this massive, newly freed population go on to conquer Canaan? And does the archaeological record support that next phase, given this revised Middle Bronze Age timeline?
Next, we'll move on to the final part of the book, which discusses the conquest of the Promised Land and the period of the Judges, and how that fits into this revised timeline. Join us as we continue the deep dive.